All right, thanks for joining me tonight, everyone. I'm Bryan Waldman. I'm the president of the Sinas Dramis Law firm, and I teach most of the cases our law firm handles involve people who have been injured in automobile collisions. I also teach a class at Michigan State's law school on the auto no-fault law, or the laws that apply to people when they've been involved in an automobile collision. And I've been a cyclist for many, many years, decades. And I've always represented a lot of cyclists. And so most recently, I've started a group called Michigan Bicycle Law that is intended to just protect the rights of cyclists in every way possible under the law. If you have questions, you can send them to me through a chat while I'm doing this, or you can just unmute yourself and speak up. We'll have time at the end for questions also. And I've put in the chat the URL for the website, and also indicated that anybody who has questions can email them to either me or my partner, Brian McKenna, I'm Brian with a Y at MichiganBicycleLaw.com. Brian McKenna is Brian with an I at MichiganBicycleLaw.com. And what we really want to talk about today is this new or change to an existing law that went into effect about a week ago. In Michigan, we've got something that's unique called the Michigan Auto No-Fault Law, or Auto No-Fault Act. And so let's go back and look at the history a little bit. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but in the early 70s, insurance companies nationally were concerned that litigation costs were driving up the rates of insurance. And nationally, they asked to move to what they called the no-fault system. More than any other state, Michigan kind of dove in and adopted this auto no-fault law. And again, the purpose was to reduce litigation expenses. And the reason that insurance companies said they needed this was because every single time there was a minor fender bender, there was a dispute about who was at fault, who should pay for the property damage to the car, who should pay for the medical bills if anybody was injured. And so every time anyone had just a minor whiplash, they were suing the other driver saying, I'm entitled to money. And so the Michigan legislature said, we're going to take care of this. We're going to do what you're asking, insurance industry. We're going to adopt this no-fault system. And as part of that no-fault system, we're going to eliminate all these little claims for fender benders and minor injuries. And so we adopted the system that we're going to go through called the No-Fault Act. And it's important to cyclists because if you're like most cyclists, you own a lot of bikes and either one or two, maybe three cars. And so when you look at the Auto No-Fault Act, there's interaction for you as a cyclist with motor vehicles or automobiles. And there's also interaction for you. Jessica's waiting. There we go. And there's also interaction with motor vehicles when you're a motorist, both with other automobiles and your automobile. And so when we go through the Auto No-Fault Act and all the laws that apply to cyclists in Michigan, you want to keep in mind of a few things that are not instinctive. They're counter-instinctive. And the first is a motor vehicle is defined under the Michigan Vehicle Code to include things with motors and four wheels. So cars, trucks, but not motorcycles and not bicycles. On top of that, a vehicle specifically excludes anything that is propelled by human power. So it specifically excludes bicycles, and it also excludes e-bikes. And excluding bicycles from the term vehicle is unique to, maybe not unique to Michigan, but in most states, a bicycle is considered a vehicle. There's pros and cons for cyclists that were not considered vehicles, but in Michigan, it's not considered a vehicle. All right. So when you buy your automobile insurance, and I'm sure everybody reads their auto insurance policy, I always ask jurors that question, and it's very, very rare that anybody ever says they've read their policy. But there's certain coverages that everyone is required to buy or has been required to buy up until about a week ago. The mandatory coverages are something called personal protection insurance, or PIP. That's the traditional no-fault coverage. Property protection insurance, or PPI, which we'll talk about. It covers property damage to things other than cars. Bodily injury or liability damage, property damage, and then there's many optional coverages. And just some of them are included here. Some of them you probably have heard of, like collision and comprehensive. Hopefully you've heard of uninsured and underinsured. If not, we're going to talk about that tonight. And then there's limited property damage. You can even buy life insurance through your auto policy. And rather than go through each one, it's probably easiest just to talk about examples and these coverages in a real world example or a hypothetical example. So let's take a typical bicycle versus automobile crash. In a typical bicycle versus automobile crash, there are 4 or 5 potential claims that the injured cyclist has. But if that injured cyclist is like most cyclists, the one they care about the most is this second one, number 2, the property protection insurance claim, because that's the claim that's going to pay for their bicycle. So even though the way that lawyers think about it, that's the second claim, let's talk about it and get it out of the way real quick. Under the old law and the new law, if you're a cyclist and you're involved in a crash with a motor vehicle, even if there's not contact with that automobile, you are going to get your bike paid for, either repaired or replacement less depreciation, whichever is less, from the insurance company of the automobile or automobiles that are involved in the crash. And so that is not going to change. And it's not going to matter what coverage you buy. That will still be a mandatory coverage that someone has to have. So unless they're driving without insurance, you'll be able to make a property damage claim with the driver's insurance company or the motor vehicle's insurance company. If they're not insured, then hopefully you have homeowners or renters insurance that will cover the property damage to your bicycle. The second claim is, again, the personal protection insurance. That is the traditional no-fault. There are 3 basic benefits when there's an injury. It includes something called allowable expenses, which it includes, that's the big one, medical bills. It's all reasonably necessary products, services, and accommodations for an injured person's care, recovery, or rehabilitation. And so what does that mean? It means it is a fantastic health insurance policy if you've been hurt, as long as it's a reasonable charge for a product, service, or accommodation that's reasonable for your needs. You're going to get it paid for by your own no-fault insurance company, and it doesn't matter who's at fault for the crash. So it includes your medical bills, it includes your therapies, it includes medical appliances, it includes transportation, including reimbursement for mileage to and from the physician and the pharmacy. Anything that is a product, service, or accommodation. So even if you had to widen the doorways because you were now in a wheelchair, or have a handicap accessible ramp put on your house, that's going to be covered under a traditional no-fault plan. The second no-fault benefit when there's an injury is wage loss. Wage loss is paid for up to 3 years at 85% of gross pay, up to a monthly maximum, which is adjusted every year. It's right now around $5,700 a month. I think it's actually $5,718 a month. And again, that lasts for 3 years. Then there's something called replacement services. That's a small $20 per day benefit that can last for up to 3 years. The big thing about the allowable expenses or the medical expenses is that they're available for life. And there's no monetary cap. And that is what the law has always been up until about a week ago. And that's where the law has changed. And people now have the ability to not buy lifetime and uncapped medical or allowable expenses. We'll talk about those changes and the choices that you'll have. Now, the injured cyclist will get all those benefits from the personal protection insurance, PIP, from their own auto insurance company typically. They don't have insurance. There's a priority scheme, but they will have no-fault insurance as long as there's involvement of a motor vehicle. And then they'll have a claim against the other driver, which is this claim number 3, which is the bodily injury claim. I don't know why I can't get this thing to work here. There. The bodily injury claim. And that's for everything that's not covered in personal protection insurance. So typically the bodily injury claim, you can bring a claim or a lawsuit against the driver that causes the accident. You have to prove that they were negligent or at fault. And then you can only claim the damages that aren't covered by no fault. So typically that's what the law calls non-economic damages, things like pain and suffering, change in lifestyle, not able to do the things you normally could do. And then any wage loss above and beyond what's available in no-fault coverage. Now, what if the driver that hits you doesn't have insurance? About 20% of the drivers on Michigan roads don't have insurance. That's called an uninsured motorist claim. And what happens is on your own insurance coverage, your own auto policy, there's an optional coverage that you can buy called uninsured motorist coverage. And what you're essentially doing is you're buying insurance for that person that's so irresponsible that they're driving without insurance in case they hit you. So if someone's had 3 DUIs and they no longer have a driver's license, but they're out driving, you've just bought that person insurance if they hit you so that you can bring a claim against your own insurance company as if you were bringing that claim against the uninsured driver. Your insurance company will pay you whatever you would be entitled to receive from that uninsured driver, and then they go after the uninsured driver to try and get their money back. And by the way, under most policies, a hit and run driver is considered an uninsured driver, which is important for cyclists because we're disproportionately involved in crashes involving hit and runs. Underinsured motorist coverage is just like uninsured motorist coverage, but it's an optional coverage, but it applies not when the person who hits you doesn't have any insurance. It's when they have insurance, but they've got a real crappy policy or a policy that doesn't have much coverage. And so if they can't cover all of your damages with their policy, you can then turn around and go after your own insurance policy as if they had more insurance. And that's called underinsured motorist coverage. It works the same way. All right. We talked about the no-fault benefits that are available, the medical bills, wage loss, something called replacement services. The next question is, how do I know if I have uninsured and underinsured motorist benefits or what coverages I have? Most people, every 6 months, they get what's called a declarations sheet or a declaration page from their insurance company. It looks like a bill because it lists everything that you pay for, but also lists all your coverages. And so in this policy, you'll see it says residual uninsured motorist coverage, $250,000 per person, $500,000 per occurrence. So this person who bought this policy, if they get hit by an uninsured driver, can sue their own insurance company or bring a claim against their own insurance company, which is auto owners, for up to $250,000. They also have underinsured motorist coverage. If the person who hit them only had a $50,000 insurance policy and their damages were $250,000, they'd make a claim against the person who hit them for the first $50,000, and then they could come against their own insurance company for an additional $200,000. Right. So that's the way the law worked until June 11, 2019. So from 1973 until June 11, 2019, we had a law that worked as I described with this unlimited medical or unlimited allowable expenses. And then the legislature and the governor met on Mackinac Island, which is a place where we don't allow cars at all, and that's where they symbolically signed this legislation to change the law that's going to apply to automobiles and insurance. Some of the changes they made to the law went into effect on the date that the law was signed, June 11, 2019. Most of those changes don't affect a lot of people. They have not affected a lot of cyclists, but they would affect some cyclists who didn't have their own auto policy in terms of where they go for coverage. But the real big changes took effect, the law of words, at after July 1, 2020. So I read that to mean beginning on July 2, 2020. And the big change is that that allowable expense, or that medical coverage, is no longer unlimited. It's no longer lifetime without any monetary cap. People have options in terms of what they want to buy. And so it essentially has to do with choices and people saying, I'm sorry, what if I don't want to buy unlimited lifetime medical? Why should I be forced to pay for that? And I want to be able to pick and choose what coverage I want to pay for. My concern is that there's a difference between a choice and a guess. And when it comes to auto insurance policies, most people don't understand what they're buying right now. They don't understand the law right now, and we've just made the law more complicated, and we've created a lot more choices within the policy beyond those choices I showed you at the beginning of mandatory coverages and optional coverages. And so what I hope to do today, if nothing else, is help everybody understand what their choices are, so that when their auto policy is up for renewal next and your agent says, okay, it's time to make choices, you'll know what choices you're making. Whether you follow my recommendations or not is less important than at least understanding them and knowing what the consequences of those choices are going to be. So let's talk about it. The allowable expenses, the medical expense under the no-fault law, is where the big change is. And so everybody up until July 2, 2020 was buying lifetime uncapped. People will now have the option of buying medical expenses or allowable expenses that are capped at $500,000, $250,000. People who are Medicaid recipients will actually be able to potentially get $50,000, their medical capped at $50,000. You can still buy lifetime uncapped. And then some people will be able to opt out, and we'll talk about that. I've listed it here as the 250 excluder opt-out and the Medicare opt-out. And then there's other choices that need to be made called coordination or priority, who comes first, and something called an attendant care rider and a managed care option. So let's talk about, let me see what slide's next here. All right, let's talk about what happens if you buy one of these four options. All right. So your agent's going to say, hey, you've got to pick lifetime 500, 250, 50. What are the benefits of each of those? Well, if you pick lifetime uncapped, you have kind of this Cadillac insurance that I've explained into the future. And as part of the deal with the legislature adopting this new law, the insurance industry has agreed that on average, there will be a premium reduction of 10% per person who opts for the lifetime uncapped. So if you say, hey, I want to keep the lifetime, I want to keep uncapped, unlimited coverage, you're statistically should see a 10% reduction in your policy. Doesn't mean you will see a 10% reduction in your policy, but on average, people across the state who pick lifetime should see a 10% reduction. So you get the same thing for 10% less for that coverage. If you say, hey, I'm good with capping it at 500,000, I might get hurt, but I'm not going to get hurt and require more than 500,000 in medical bills, you can do that, and you will get a 20% reduction on average, not you specifically, but the consumers at large. If you pick the 250 there'll be a 30% reduction. And then if you pick the 50,000, I think the average reduction is 40%, but I honestly can't remember if that's true or not. So whatever you do, it's going to be less. Now, what are the consequences of picking less? Keep in mind that the leading cause of bankruptcy in the country, far and away, are medical expenses. And people may say, hey, I don't need lifetime uncapped medical expenses on my auto policy because I have Blue Cross or I have Medicare. So let's talk about that. If you go into your agent and you say, I want the 250 cap, the lowest one I can have without being a Medicaid recipient, you will then be given the option of opting out completely. To do that, you have to show your agent that you've got what's called a qualified health plan, which means you have to have a health insurance plan that will cover injuries that you sustain in an automobile collision. So the policy has to be written in a way where it doesn't exclude auto injuries. And then you can say, I don't want to be in the system at all. Well, why wouldn't you do that if you have a really good Blue Cross policy? Well, people with really good Blue Cross policies tend to have really good jobs. And people who get seriously injured and need lifetime medical expenses, and I know many who have, typically don't keep those jobs because they can't go back to work. And if you can't keep your job, then you typically don't get to keep your health insurance. And again, this is for life. This isn't what's going to pay your medical expenses for the next 6 months or the next year or the next 2 years. It's for life. So in my opinion, that's actually the most dangerous thing you can do, is say, I'm happy with my Blue Cross policy, because you're only thinking short term. And yeah, you can pick up your Blue Cross policy if you lose your job through COBRA, but if you don't have a job, that may not be an easy thing for you to do each month, is pay that bill to keep your Blue Cross coverage or your PHP coverage or whatever it is. There's also, if you can show that you're a Medicare recipient and everyone in your household is a Medicare recipient, you can opt out of the no-fault allowable expense system. Again, there are risks that go along with it. Here's a chart that I did not create. It was created actually by an insurance agent. And it shows what's covered under auto no-fault compared what's covered with Medicare. So if you need a residential treatment program because of a brain injury, a spinal cord injury, it's covered under auto no fault. Not going to happen with Medicare. If you need a guardian or conservator appointed, all expenses associated with that are covered under your no fault policy. It's not covered under Medicare. You need transportation services to or from the doctor. Yes, under auto, not under Medicare. So the way I look at it is, every insurance policy kind of has its strengths and weaknesses. Health insurance, private health insurance policies, there's a wide range. You kind of have to read the policies, know what's covered, know what the deductibles are. But I've never seen a private policy that's as good as an auto no-fault policy in terms of what it will pay. So in my view, kind of the top tier is your auto no-fault policy. Then you've got your standard private, like Blue Cross policies. Again, some are better than others. Then your Medicare policy, and then at the very bottom, your Medicaid policy. And if you don't have an auto no-fault policy and you lose your health insurance, lose your job, you're probably eventually going to become a Medicaid recipient and have a Medicaid policy paying for this stuff or not paying for it. We don't need to talk about attendant care riders today, but at some point in the future, I might do something on that to talk to people about it. Coordination of benefits is another option you have. Coordination of benefits just says who comes first. Under the old law, under the new law, when you buy an auto policy, you have the right to say, I want my auto insurance to come first and pay $1, or I only want my auto insurance to pay whatever my Blue Cross or my PHP doesn't cover. Usually, not usually, you do get a discount if you buy an auto policy that is secondary or coordinated, and that option will continue to exist, and you will continue to be able to get the discount if you do that. There are lots of risks in terms of bills falling through the cracks. And there's also risks with your health insurance company being able to lien or obtain recovery on money that you might get from the at-fault driver. In other words, they get paid back out of that money potentially. But that's a more complicated process. But if people have questions about it. And so we can talk about that if people have questions, but it's a pretty complicated scenario. Managed care option. I have this kind of labeled obviously as a trap because that's what I think it is. Under the new law, insurance companies have the right to sell you a policy that says that your allowable expenses or medical expenses are covered if you treat with one of the doctors on their approved list. Now, these insurance companies already have approved lists of doctors. And frankly, most of the doctors on that list are not people I would want to see. They're not people I would want my friends and family to see. Some of them are good, but the ones that are good are the exception. The example I've given in the past is I had a client who treated with probably the country's expert, if not the world expert, in post-traumatic stress disorder. She was an athlete who was attacked by a dog when she was out for a run and had a severe reaction to it. There's no question her doctor was the right guy. The insurance company sent her to a psychiatrist that they were going to make their decisions on whether they paid for things. And that doctor testified at trial that he had not seen a person with PTSD in over 30 years. So that's really that you're risking getting treatment with that quality of practitioner. And I think a no-brainer is you do not want to limit yourself to only being treated by doctors that are on an insurance company list. So that said, what should you purchase? For myself, and to anybody who asks, would highly recommend, this is what I'm doing, sticking with lifetime allowable expenses. Again, there's no promise you'll have a reduction in your premium that you're paying now, but on average, it should be 10% less. And it, in my opinion, gives you the best coverage. And if you're a cyclist, you're a vulnerable roadway user. Your injuries could be severe. Hopefully that you won't have injuries at all, but insurance is for the worst case scenario, not the best case scenario. And so that's why you buy the insurance. You're also at risk of being in a hit and run or hit by someone who's uninsured. So if you don't have uninsured motorist coverage, I would get it, and I would make sure that it's significant enough to cover you if you have been in a crash. I'd buy significant underinsured motorist coverage. And then for a lot of people, particularly people who have significant assets, because one of the reasons you buy insurance is if you make a mistake or your kids make a mistake driving your car, or your spouse makes a mistake, it's the liability coverage that protects your personal assets. And so an umbrella policy is typically a cost-effective way to buy more liability coverage or bodily injury coverage. And if you buy an umbrella policy through some insurance companies, they will let you add uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage to the umbrella policy. Again, you typically have to ask for it. A lot of agents don't even know that you can get an umbrella policy with uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage, but you can absolutely do it. And so in my opinion, you should, if you're going to get an umbrella policy. Not everybody needs one of those though. Absolutely avoid managed care plans or the managed care option. And then uncoordinated, I think, is a better option than coordinated. But you're going to have to see what kind of discount you're getting from your agent between the two and decide whether that's right for you. So again, if you look at this is the declaration sheet. This is a citizen's policy for someone who bought $500,000 in liability coverage. They bought $500,000 in uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage, and you can see what that costs for this vehicle. It's $49 for the year. For this vehicle, it's a lot more. That has to do with who the driver is and where it's located. And for this one, it's $49. You can see the collision is what's the most expensive on policies. And then the lifetime no-fault benefits, personal injury coverage, here it is, $133 on this car, $506 on this car. So again, this car's, again, has a lot to do with location. You ought to obviously buy homeowners or renters insurance too. That's really not the topic here today. But if your bicycle is not in, I'm sorry, if you're out riding your bicycle and you get hit by a car, it's going to be covered under that PPI claim that we talked about. If you're driving with the bike on your car or your bike is stolen, then you're going to want to make a claim against your homeowners or renters policy to get it paid for. And some insurance companies require a rider for a bicycle, the same as they would for like an engagement ring or a piece of art. So you need to check with your agent to make sure your bicycles are covered. In my experience, typically if you have a State Farm policy, it's not covered. If you have almost any other insurance company, based on my experience, it is covered without a rider. We talked about the umbrella policy. The umbrella policies cover everything, not just your automobile, but your home, your boat, your motorcycle, whatever you have. And what I recommend to people is shop around. We've seen insurance companies raise people's rates up to 5 times what the rate was. And then you go out and shop around and the rate comes back down to where it was with another insurance company. You see people with bumper stickers, AAA for the last 30 years. I don't think AAA is loyal to you. They're not giving you a break because of 30 years. Maybe they're telling you they are. It's not significant. Shop it around. You'll probably find a better price from another insurance company. And my advice to people is if you can, go with an independent agent. If you have an agent that you really like, give that agent a chance. The difference is a captive agent can only sell one type of insurance, one company's insurance. So they work only for insurance company X. If, for example, State Farm agents tend to be captive agents. An independent agent can shop around, look at different policies and help you get a better rate, help you get better coverages for a reasonable rate. If you want me to review your policy, I'm happy to do that. All you need to do is email me a copy of that declaration sheet we talked about, and I will take a look at it. If for some reason you don't like my tie or the way I look, you can email Brian McKenna, and he will look at your policy and tell you what he thinks, and we may have more questions and want to talk to you to find out what your specific needs are, but we'll give you our best advice. We're happy to do that because everybody's going to have these renewals coming up and they're going to have choices, and we want to help you at least make an informed choice. And that's all I have. If people have questions, I'm happy to answer them. You can either unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can just send it in the chat. I'm looking at the question, one question in the chat. And I'll read the question for everyone. The numbers, 50,000, 250, 500,000 are much larger than my deductible. If I'm not worried about meeting my health insurance deductible, do I need to worry about explanations? Oh, and then it says the explanation was very good, thanks. So I think I answered that question, but if I didn't, feel free to chime in. It's really not what's going to cover your deductible, but a limitation. And you can get a deductible on your auto allowable expense policy. I think on that deck sheet that we pulled up, the limit was at, I think there was a deductible of $300 or something like that.
Yeah, I did ask that question, and you answered it right after I asked it. So thank you, Brian.
Sure, yeah. Any other questions? Did everything I say make sense? Great, I'm going to turn the record off.